Thank you for clicking on today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing the second webinar in a series of 8 webinars concerning developing a training and assessment strategy. My name is Nick, so today I'll be the one running through developing a training assessment strategy with you. This webinar mostly focuses on your first assessment concerning where you will have to create a training and assessment strategy for your projects. Okay, so we're going to discuss what's in a training assessment strategy, why you need a training assessment strategy or a TAS, and then how else you can contextualize the training assessment strategy. Let's begin with going through the learning objectives. Okay, so in today's webinar, we're going to be discussing 5 different learning objectives. So firstly, we're going to learn how to understand why a TAS must be developed if conducting training and assessment within the vocational sector. We're going to look at identifying key compliance issues associated with a TAS. This is because a TAS document is ingrained within the standards for RTOs 2015. So one of the main reasons you're doing it is because it is a compliance requirement for pretty much every training provider. We're going to be looking at defining the core components of a TAS document. So what's involved in a TAS, what information. Also going to be looking at volume of learning. So what is volume of learning and how can we apply the volume of learning to a TAS? We're also going to look at how you can apply contextualization guidelines to a TAS. So therefore your TAS is contextualized to your own personal needs as well as your organizational needs. So we're going to be talking a lot about these things in today's webinar. Okay, so what is a training and assessment strategy, or a TAS? A TAS is a document justifying that your RTO is training and assessing a specific qualification consistently to a high standard, in compliance with ASQA standards, and in compliance with industry standards. A TAS does all of these things because it forms the backbone of every single qualification an RTO offers on their scope. So think of it as kind of like a plan on how to train and assess a qualification. So in the vocational education and training sector, a TAS is required for numerous reasons. But first, some background information. When an RTO decides to include a new qualification to train and assess learners in, they must apply for registration with ASQA prior to training and assessing. This is called applying for scope, and if you search for the RTO's registration details on train.gov.au, you will be able to find a list of all the qualifications the RTO has approval for training and assessing in. Once an RTO has approval, then they can offer their course. The application process requires the RTO to design and develop a training assessment strategy, which must be submitted to ASQA alongside the scope application. This is so that ASQA, as the quality control authority, can decide whether your proposed training and assessment meets the quality standards. This process also ensures that RTOs are not training and assessing by simply winging it, as the TAS defines all of the policies and procedures involved with the specific qualification. It can be assumed that every qualification on an RTO scope has a high quality TAS and should therefore be retained for compliance and auditing purposes. Even if ASQA approves your scope application, your TAS document will still require regular reviews to ensure it remains up to date with industry and organizational standards, policies, and procedures. As such, during an audit of your RTO, representatives of ASQA might need to review your TAS to ensure its currency. Finally, the TAS can be an internal reference tool for all trainers and assessors in case they need to review any information they are not familiar with. Okay, so we've talked a lot about scope applications. For why we need a TAS. They are needed because you have to submit one if you're applying for scope for application for a course. Without a TAS, you can't have without a TAS, you can't have a course on your scope. Without a course on your scope, you can't train and assess. So this is why this is one of the first things you will be doing within your course is designing training assessment strategies. So let's look more to do with compliance. So in the User's Guide for the Standards for RTOs 2015, clauses 1.1 through to 1.4 specifically discuss the requirements of developing and implementing a comprehensive training and assessment strategy. Now, just something to consider here, that the very first clauses within this piece of legislation concerns designing and developing a quality training and assessment strategy. So it's a very important document to have. Each of these 4 clauses identifies specific items which must be included in your training assessment strategy. It is worth noting that a TAS does not need to be one single document. However, it might be easy to keep all these inclusions in the same document. Okay, so there's 4 different clauses here. The first one, the TAS demonstrates that learners can meet the course requirements. So the TAS is designed so that a learning program is able to be completed, and not only just by the learners, but so that the training organization is able to deliver a course that can meet the course requirements. That also ties in with clause 1.2, so that the RTO must determine the existing skills of learner and mode of delivery. So mode of delivery, is it online, is it face-to-face, is it blended? And also need to identify and determine the existing skills of learners, because that can contribute to how the learning program can be completed by learners. If you're offering, say, an engineering course, you want to make sure that your learners have some proficiency in numeracy, for example. Clause 1.3 concerns that the RTO has sufficient trainers, services, resources, and facilities. So that seems fairly self-explanatory, but you can't just have one trainer training 2,000 people, for example. You need to make sure that you have training assessment services and resources, and if there's facilities wherever needed. And also clause 1.4, so the RTO practices are consistent with the relevant training package. So that talks a lot about packaging rules, as well as anything specific to the particular training package it comes from. So the training assessment qualification comes within the TAE package. So there's some certain requirements and guidelines that we need to follow when we were designing this qualification and the training assessment strategy for this qualification. Alright, so what you're seeing here are some examples of what an RTO should include within the TAS as a minimum. Okay, this isn't an exhaustive list, there's still a lot more that needs to be put on, but this makes up the majority of the TAS. And as these are the key components, we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these. So the first one, the training product. So what qualification or standalone unit of competency do you intend to deliver? For example, the Certificate 4 in Training and Assessment. That might seem pretty obvious, but you do need to specify on your TAS what training product you're going to offer. Core and elective components. So we talked a lot about packaging rules and core and elective units within the previous webinar. So within the TAS, you just need to ensure that you select units that comply with the qualifications packaging rules. If you select units which don't comply with the packaging rules, your scope application isn't going to go so well. So look at the packaging rules, make sure they comply. Shouldn't have too many problems there. Okay, so we're just going to skip down a little bit. So we're looking at assessment, resources, methods, and timing. So how are you going to assess learners? For example, in this workbook that you're currently completing, you would be completing what's called an underpinning knowledge section, a case scenario, and a practical component. These will need to be identified on and consistent with the TAS. How long will it take to complete these assessments? When you originally enrolled, you would have received a training plan that identifies suggested timeframes to complete the units so that you can complete your course within a designated timeframe. For face-to-face classes, the timing of assessment should be different. It will likely reflect having assignments due at specific times, examination periods, etc. Okay, we're also going to talk about human resources. So who is going to train and assess in these units? As per clause 1.3, the RTO must have sufficient trainers and assessors to deliver the training and assessment. Essentially, this means you should probably have at least 2 trainers and assessors per course you offer, and this will need to be identified on the TAS to meet that standard. So as you can probably identify, these standards are in place to ensure the RTO is sufficiently prepared to conduct training and assessment within a vet context. These inclusions not only ensure RTOs are compliant with the standards, but also so that the learners receive a quality training experience. Okay, so now we're just going to have a quick look at a sample learning program for a full qualification. So whilst this sample here doesn't actually have a specific qualification in mind, there's a lot of components in here on the left-hand side in yellow, which you will need to be complete, which you will need to complete within your projects. So we're going to talk about a few of these as we go. So as you can see in here, there's quite a few notes which you can refer to as well. So this information can be found from the Training RTO Simulated RTO website. Alright, so let's just talk about a few things. So let's talk about the course duration. So the course duration must be consistent with the volume of learning based on the AQF level of the course you have selected. So we're going to talk about volume of learning a little bit later on in this webinar, but basically there are specific guidelines provided which give you guidance on how long a qualification should go for depending on its AQF level. So you would expect a certificate 4 level course to go for between half a year and 2 years. The volume of learning, it was implemented just to ensure that short duration training was scrapped, because how can you achieve, say, a Cert 4 and training assessment within 2 weeks, so keep that in mind with your course duration. Is you just want to make sure it's consistent with the volume of learning and it's reasonable. So again, it might not take 4 years to complete a Cert 1 in business. You might not be able to complete an entire diploma of engineering within a few weeks. Okay, so we spoke about the packaging rules in the previous webinar. So when you're completing this section, just copy the packaging rules into here. Again, that's just so that you can comply with these packaging rules. Okay. Alright, so when you're completing this section here, this is where you identify which units of competency you have selected in your qualification. Now, our guidance is that as long as it complies with the packaging rules, then you shouldn't run into too many problems. You're welcome to import units if the packaging rules allow you to import units. You're allowed to use electives, again, as long as it complies with the packaging rules. Our guidance is don't select any less, don't select any more. If you select any less, then that is non-compliant. If you select more and you're considering giving students, say, a range of electives to select from, just for the purpose of this exercise, if you could just select units which comply with the packaging rules, that would make completing this activity a lot simpler. So we need to see that you can select units which comply with the packaging rules. Okay, and this even says this here in the important section. Only list the number of units needed to satisfy the packaging rules. Don't list every possible unit. Okay, so when you go on training.gov.au, you will usually see there's a huge list of elective units which can be selected. Don't list everything, only list units which you are going to offer. A key component of a TAS and how you design a TAS depends on the target learners and the characteristics of the learners. So depending on which qualification you're offering, you could have the same qualification but offered to different target learners and have completely different units selected. You can have completely different learning resources, activities, etc. So target learners, what kinds of jobs or roles do you think your learners will have? So this should relate back to the purpose of the program. For instance, a course on beekeeping won't be much use if your target learners are automotive mechanics. Okay, that's fairly simple, but target learners, say you're offering a qualification to school leavers, that would be different to if you're offering the same qualification to a target learner group of over 50s, for example. The younger cohort, they might not have as much experience in doing a certain course, so therefore they might require more support services or more learning resources, versus if you're offering it to an older cohort, that, they'd probably have some more life experience. They'd be familiar with, how the world works within a workplace. So identifying the target learners can influence a lot within your training assessment strategy. And again, this also flows on with the characteristics. So have a look at the characteristics. There's some examples here, which you're more than welcome to use when you're creating your training assessment strategy. So like the example I gave, just consider the differences between different target learners and the characteristics of these target learners, because that can seriously influence how you design your training assessment strategy. Okay, so required facilities and equipment. So what do you need to offer the students in your course so that they can complete the course? You need to make sure it's sufficient. You want to make sure that your learners have a good, positive learning experience. So you can't just hand them a blank piece of paper. Maybe you want to, if you're offering, say, a hospitality course, you might need to give them access to, kitchen and kitchenware, for example. When you're identifying the support services, this is just a list of general support services which you might have available on you. So you're not going to know what every single student's support services are, otherwise the list would be infinitely long. Perhaps you could just list different support services that you as an RTO would offer, which would cover a lot of unanticipated outcomes. So for example, a support service might simply be allowing the student to have more one-on-one time with the trainer, or perhaps there's additional learning materials. Okay, when we're talking about reasonable adjustment options, again, this is just planning for the worst. So for example, a reasonable adjustment option can be both for learning and assessment. Say for example, you're offering a course face-to-face, but then for whatever reason, someone is no longer able to attend that face-to-face course, and they need to finish off that course using a different means. So perhaps there might be a reasonable adjustment available for that particular learner. Just keep in mind the word reasonable. Just, you're not meant to bend over backwards for everyone, but if you can, within your skills and expertise, offer a reasonable adjustment which doesn't distort or give an unfair advantage to that student, then go for it. Probably an easier example to think of when it comes to assessment is if someone is doing, say you've organized to have a written questionnaire as one of your assessments. So it's entirely written. Everyone sits in the classroom for 20-30 minutes to answer these written questions. But one of your learners has hurt their wrist, their writing hand, they can't write. So a reasonable adjustment might be offering to assess that learner by verbal means. So that way it's not distorting any of the outcomes, it's not damaging the integrity of the assessment, it's just an alternative way of being assessed. It's still the learner's work, it's still authentic, it's just a different means. Okay, so we're looking now at the delivery and assessment arrangements. So when you're looking at the delivery and assessment arrangements, you're looking at which order of units would you like to offer it in. You don't need to do it based on the list shown on train.gov.au, and we don't for this qualification. You're basically just identifying, what in your opinion is the most logical progression of completing this qualification. So in this example, or the course you're completing right now, is that we've offered the TAE DES 401 and TAE DES 402 units first, because there is a lot of foundation knowledge which concerns training assessment, which will help later on in your course. If we started with one of the assessment units, that might cause a lot of confusion because that one can get fairly technical, for example. So this is why we offer these two units first. Okay, so what delivery mode, like we mentioned, is it workplace, classroom, is it online? consider different assessment methods. So that would also be based on your target learners and also your mode of delivery. So, you're completing this qualification as an online course. Our mode of delivery is entirely, web-based. So you're completing written questions and sending them through. You're recording videos and sending them through. Whereas if you're in face-to-face, they might be a bit different. It's the same with the assessment tools as well. So the tools and methods tie in with each other. If you just list a few examples of methods and tools here, you really can't go too wrong. Again, this is just a plan. You're not actually applying for scope for this qualification. It's just a project. As long as you can identify different methods and tools, can't really go wrong there. Okay, we spoke about human resources. So, which trainer is going to train and assess different units of competency? So, in a practical situation on your TAS, you need to make sure you can identify that you have sufficient trainers and that they're all qualified in training and assessing. Okay, then just some legislative stuff to go at the end. What's your assessment validation schedule? What's your transition requirements? You haven't covered anything to do with validations just yet. So a lot of this information, you can use the information from the sample learning program when you're completing yours. And same with these last final, compliancy parts of the training assessment strategy. Okay, so we've just gone through an example of a training assessment strategy that can be found on the Training RTO website, so use that sample when you're completing your projects. So now we're going to move on to the volume of learning. So when you're developing your training and assessment strategy, there are some things to keep in mind, and one of these is the volume of learning. In essence, the volume of learning focuses on the entire educational experience. As you can see in the slide, volume of learning includes teaching, individual study, assessment activities, and other components involved with training. Your training and assessment strategy will need to identify these requirements and can drastically impact on how your TAS is developed. The Australian Qualifications Framework has developed some guidelines on the volume of training depending on what ACURF level the qualification stems from. So as mentioned, the volume of learning is more of a guide as opposed to a concrete requirement. The logic here is that to fulfill the requirements of the certain ACURF level qualification, the learner should apply the specified amount of hours in developing the skills and knowledge. For example, you are currently completing the Certificate 4 in Training and Assessment. As a Certificate 4 level course, the expected time frame to develop and refine all the essential skills and knowledge required within the qualification should range between half a year to 2 years. As you should be aware, the course that you're currently completing is offered as a 12-month course, which complies with this guideline. And this guideline is identified within our training and assessment strategy. For further guidance, we provide a training plan which suggests to complete each unit within a month, which also is identified on the training assessment strategy. Our reasoning is that to fully understand the requirements of each unit, reading the learner manual, conducting personal research, completing assessment activities, etc., should take roughly a month at a time for each unit of competency. So the first the first workbook you're completing is the TAE DS 401 and the TAE DES 402. That's 2 units of competency. We would anticipate that you'd have everything submitted and completed within the first 2 months of this learning program. Okay, so a common question that we hear is how quickly can I complete this course? And the answer is usually along the lines of it should take between 6 to 12 months. 6 to 12 months because the 6 months is the minimum of the volume of learning, and the 12 months is what we offer within our training assessment strategy. And because this course is offered as an online self-paced course, there's a lot that depends on how fast you complete it, like your life circumstances. So are you working? Are you looking after children, for example? That being said, if you are able to complete the assessments faster than the 6 month suggested minimum, even when taking into account the turnaround times, we can't simply say you have finished everything in 4 months but the minimum volume of learning is 6 months. Please wait a couple of months before you receive your certificate. So this is saying, what we're trying to say here is that even though the volume of learning says at least 6 months, if you're still able to complete everything sooner than that, everything's compliant, you've ticked every box, there's nothing stopping us from issuing your qualification. Okay, again, this is more or less just a guideline. So speaking of guidelines, you might have noticed that in the past, some RTOs offered short courses such as 5-day intensives, which on face value clearly does not adhere to these guidelines. Usually in these instances, the RTO would use these 5 days for providing as much classroom learning as possible, and then specify an extended time frame after this intensive to complete the assessments in the learner's own time, so that the RTO adheres to the volume of learning. If an RTO identifies the course duration of their course to fall outside these guidelines, the RTO must clearly describe how and why the course can be completed within a faster time frame. This would likely apply to a learning program where the TAS identifies a very specific group of target learners with higher than expected entry requirements, such as offering a certificate for in leadership and management to managers working in a chain of retail stores. This reinforces how a TAS can differ based on the volume of learning of the course being offered. Taking the volume of learning into consideration is one thing. Now you will also need to contextualize your TAS. Contextualization refers to customizing components to suit different users based on different requirements. As can be seen, there are a few reasons why a TAS can be contextualized. As each RTO is different, you can be almost certain that if 2 different RTOs offered the same course, they would have different TAS documents. This is largely because the TAS should comply with organizational policies and procedures. For example, different RTOs would have different learning resources. We offer a learning manual, whereas other RTOs might offer a textbook. RTOs can also differ in the way they collect evidence and the way they define the target learners and their characteristics. The mode of delivery would also differentiate as an RTO's TAS with another RTO's TAS. As you should be aware, the course you are currently completing is all distance-based or online. Therefore, the TAS we have developed focuses on and suits this mode of delivery. Other RTOs would offer the same course in a face-to-face setting, which means their delivery and assessment arrangements and learning resources would differ. Sometimes RTOs are specialized to a certain industry. For example, the Certificate for in Training and Assessment that you're currently completing is a very general course which many RTOs offer. As we're not necessarily aligned with any specific industry, even though we're technically in the education industry, the training and assessment qualification can be used in pretty much any industry. So because of that, our delivery and assessment options are somewhat flexible. Some of these RTOs might focus on developing trainers to train and assess learners in specific settings, such as in first aid. In this instance, the RTO might specifically require the learner to develop a course on providing first aid, as well as conducting delivery sessions on CPR and assessing learners on their ability to provide first aid. Another way an RTO can contextualize their TAS and learning program is based on the units of competency they selected. As mentioned in the previous webinar, if an RTO is offering a qualification, they must ensure that they select units of competency which comply with the packaging requirements. There isn't really too much you can do about the core units. However, the beauty of the vet sector is the flexibility in elective units of competency. RTOs with no specific context in mind might not worry about this too much. However, RTOs developing courses with a certain target group in mind might select units to suit their needs. So if you ever have a chance, I would suggest taking a look at the packaging rules for the Diploma of Business, one of the most commonly completed vet-based qualifications. The flexibility offered in this qualification is an RTO's dream, as they can tailor a Diploma of Business to suit multiple learners' needs. Does your RTO wish to target students interested in human resources? Select more Group B units. What about being an entrepreneur? Perhaps select some more marketing and sales units of competency. Of course, the TAS you develop should be consistent in nature, so the units of competency you select should be contextualized to your target learner group. Okay, so we're just going to quickly talk about the projects within the First Learner workbook. So this is the projects for the TAE DES 401 and TAE DES 402. So if you're completing this, if you're completing the materials with the iLearn eCollege label, this will be project 1 and 2. If you're completing it with the old labels, this would be considered projects 2 and 3. So for project 1, what you're going to be doing is designing and developing a learning program based on a qualification of your choice. But the qualification must be current, and the qualification must come from train.gov.au. So you can't just make up your own qualification, no matter how fun that might be. I'm sorry, this is just a bit of, has to be done this way. So you can't just make up a certificate 3 in playing Monopoly. That doesn't even make sense. So it has to be something from train.gov.au because that's a nationally recognized course. But yeah, we spoke about this in the last webinar. Just make sure it's current. Please make sure it's current, and that's the usage recommendation. So it should be big green current next to the usage recommendation. So we did a quick look at the sample training assessment strategy before. That's probably the main document you'll be completing when you're looking at project 1. So you select your qualification, you select your target learner groups, you then base your entire training assessment strategy based on those components. All right, so here's not a complete list, but here's the things to complete and submit for this project. So this is when you're completing this project, there will be some project requirements where you'll need to send through evidence of conducting a stakeholder interview. So that needs to be completed. Also need to look at creating and completing the TAS. So again, that's probably the chunk of this project, is completing the TAS. Once you've completed the TAS, you're going to justify how your TAS complies or doesn't comply with the volume of learning. We're just looking here to see that you understand what the volume of learning is and whether your whether your learning program does comply with that or not. You're also going to complete a core skill indicator matrix. Now, when you're completing this, please don't overthink completing this document. You haven't covered the address adult language literacy and numeracy skills unit just yet, so we're not too strict when it comes to this particular document. Just follow the guidelines. Please don't overthink it, and you should be fine. You also need to conduct a risk analysis on your qualification. So that's just providing a few different risk factors involved with your learning program and how you would overcome them. Now this is where you can also get creative and create your own learning resource. Now, when we're talking about creating your own learning resource, this is where you look at the qualification and you then look for a unit of competency within the qualification you selected. You're then going to create a resource for that unit. Copying and pasting information from training.gov does not count. The information from training.gov is simply information on what a learner needs to demonstrate to achieve competency. It doesn't actually educate us in any way. It just says, here's what you got to do, just figure it out yourself on how you're going to assess it. Again, it doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't educate us on anything. So you're going to have to create a learning resource. So what is a learning resource? You can do a fact sheet, you can do a PowerPoint, slides, just anything which can be used to educate someone on that particular topic you've selected. Our guidance here is, give it some sort of energy. Pretend that you are actually going to be administering this learning resource to a group of learners. And also, we aren't experts in every single qualification out there. We're not going to be nitpicky on any of the content within the learning resource unless you decide to choose Cert 4 and Training Assessment as your qualification. So we're not going to be nitpicking on that. As long as it looks good, it reads good, and it covers a few other requirements, you should be fine there. And then you also need to conduct a review of the entire learning program. So the entire learning program is the TAS, the volume of learning, the core skills matrix, the risk analysis, and the learning resource. You're going to be reviewing all of these documents once you've created them. Okay. You're going to be seeing this kind of formula a lot throughout your projects, not just this one, but further projects where you're going to be planning, planning, creating, and then reviewing. That's a fairly standard way of approaching units of competency within VET. Okay, so that's to do with your first project. Now, you're going to be doing something very similar when you're completing project 2. You're going to be designing and developing a learning program based on an individual unit of competency from the list of units provided. Now, this has to be a forced choice. However, there are lots of different units you can select from. So the idea here is that you're not offering a full qualification, you're just picking one unit of competency. Nowhere within the TAS should it refer back to a certain qualification. Just pretend it's just a unit of competency. So say for example you are offering a learning program on providing first aid. Providing first aid is an individual unit of competency, therefore your learning program should just be based on that one unit. So you'll need to be completing and submitting pretty similar things for project 2 as project 1. So there's nothing new here, it's just, there's a specialized TAS for the individual unit, doing analysis on that TAS, create another learning resource, and then reviewing everything. When you're completing your projects, please use the samples, please use the guidelines, please use the discussions, please use these webinars, please use the trainer assistance by calling or emailing. So if you need to call us, you can call us on 1300 737 006, or you can email trainer@ilec.edu.au. Use the assistance when you can, particularly for this first assessment because there is a lot of jargon. It can get fairly technical. My overall experience with reviewing assessments for this particular assessment is that if you follow the hints, you follow the guidelines, you don't overthink things, you shouldn't run into too many problems. You just need to put on the hat of I'm preparing to be a trainer and assessor for a course in the vocational education and training industry. Okay, doesn't need to be overly complicated, or you don't need to overly complicate things either, like that sentence. It's just read with the instructions, take it for what it is. There's no deep hidden meaning in any of the instructions or hints or guidance. Just take it as it is. So that's my guidance for this project, or these projects, this assessment, and pretty much the entire course in general. So yeah, that's pretty much a wrap up for this webinar. So again, thank you for everyone for listening. My name's Nick, and I wish everyone the best with completing this assessment and the rest of their course.